Resident Evil is one of the greatest franchises ever made. Sure, it's had its ups and downs, but it's one of those games that I hold near and dear to my heart, and honestly, it's my favorite franchise ever when it comes to video games. If it wasn't for this franchise, I wouldn't be the gamer that I am today. What's up everybody, this is Mixstan and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be ranking the mainline story games of Resident Evil. And just for those of you who are wondering, yes, I do consider Code Veronica a mainline story game. So anyway, without any further ado, let's get straight into it and start ranking these games.
Resident Evil 0.
Resident Evil 0. This game's kind of tricky when I think about it. I have mixed feelings about this game. While it does handle good and it looks really good, and I do like the enemies of this game, there are some major flaws when it comes to Resident Evil 0. First and foremost, the biggest flaw of this game is the lack of an item box. There are no item boxes at all in this game, which means you have to backtrack a ton. Let me explain. So, there are two playable characters in this game, and you play them at the same time. So, you share an inventory system between Rebecca and Billy. Also, there is the introduction of dropping items on the floor. So instead of going to certain rooms or progressing through the games and opening the item box, you have to backtrack and grab these items that maybe you had to drop because you didn't have room for other items. It's a very flawed mechanic in my opinion, and I just don't know why they got rid of the item box. I guess on paper it sounds pretty good sharing inventory between two characters, but it just didn't play out well. Now with that being said, the two playable characters kind of take away from the game as well, because the way this game plays out is you switch back and forth through Rebecca and Billy basically through the entire playthrough, instead of like the other Resident Evil games where you have two different scenarios where you can play as one character or the other in one playthrough. I feel like this game was set up to be a co-op game, but for some reason it just wasn't a co-op game, and it would have been way better in my opinion if it was a co-op game. Now on to the good stuff that I really enjoy about this game. It's a prequel to the original Resident Evil. It sets up some things in the story that just weren't there before, and it gives us a little bit of a backstory on certain characters that were in Resident Evil 1. So I really do like the story elements of Resident Evil 0. And also, the game handles really well. It looks really well. It actually handles just like the Resident Evil 1 remake, which is one of the best handling classic Resident Evil games ever. So the game handles good, it looks good, the soundtrack is pretty good, and the enemies I think are decently good too. They're not the best, but they're definitely not the worst. So with all that being said, I gotta rank Resident Evil 0 not at the top and not at the bottom. I'm gonna put it at C rank.
Resident Evil.
Oh boy, Resident Evil 1, the original Resident Evil. This game literally sparked an entire genre of video games, and without this game, we wouldn't have any of the other Resident Evil games, and we wouldn't even have other games from other franchises that were inspired by its existence. I was only about 5 or 6 years old when I first was introduced to the original Resident Evil game, and I have to say, the game was terrifying. It was so scary, in fact, that I wasn't able to finish it as a kid, and I had to go back to it a little bit later in life when I was a little older. With that being said, that's the reason why I love this game, and that's the reason why this game is so good in my opinion. It's so scary. It has such a claustrophobic feeling that was like nothing else during its time. It also introduced characters that I love, characters that have stuck with me my entire life, like Jill Valentine, Chris Redfield, and of course Albert Wesker, who in my opinion is the greatest villain of all time in video games. There are so many iconic things about this game. We have the soundtrack, we have the enemies that were introduced, zombies, zombie dogs, tyrants, hunters. This game was simply amazing. And without this game, I don't think I would love video games like I do nowadays. So with that being said, I'm going to have to rank Resident Evil 1 pretty high. I don't think it's an S, but I'm going to put it at an A because there are some better games on this list that just improved on everything that Resident Evil 1 gave us.
Resident Evil.
Resident Evil 1 Remake. What is there to say about this game that wasn't said about the original game? Well, for starters, in my opinion, this is everything that the original was, but much, much more. The gameplay is much better, the mechanics are better, graphically, the game still holds up in today's standards, the soundtrack is really good. I mean, they just broadened this game so much. They took Resident Evil and just made it better. They added new locations, new enemies like Lisa Trevor and the Crimson Heads. I mean, there's nothing bad that I can say about this game. This is a game that I, on a regular basis, go back to and play very, very often, whereas to the original Resident Evil, I don't really play it that often. So with all that being said, I have to say that Resident Evil 1 Remake is a perfect game in my opinion, and we're going to put it at S rank.
Resident Evil 2.
Resident Evil 2. Where do I begin with this game? This is literally the game that made me fall in love with games, and if it wasn't for this game, I don't think I'd be the gamer that I am today. So with that being said, this is my favorite Resident Evil game of the entire series, and actually one of my favorite games of all time. This game also features my favorite video game character of all time, Leon S. Kennedy. This is the game that he was introduced in, and I think that this game was just such a big step up from the original Resident Evil. The soundtrack is 10 times better in my opinion, and also I think it might even be the best soundtrack in the series. I'm not really sure on that, but it is really good. I think the map design is much better than the Spencer Mansion. I just really love the RPD. The character design is much better as well, and the enemy design is much better. I think the Lickers are much better than the Hunters from the original game. We also get the introduction of William Birkin, we get Mr. X, and Ada Wong, who is a fan favorite. Of course, we have Claire Redfield, and we also have Hunk, who was available in a special mode after beating the game called The Fourth Survivor. So, with all this being said, I constantly go back to playing this game. It is a great game. It's one of my favorite games of all time, so you guys know where this game is going to be ranked on this list. We're putting it in S rank, and I'm going to put it actually ahead of Resident Evil 1 Remake.
Resident Evil 2.
The Resident Evil 2 Remake is the whole entire reason why the entire remake craze has started. If it wasn't for this game, all these other companies wouldn't be creating remakes, and of course Resident Evil is making a lot of remakes because of this game's success. With that being said, I'm still torn on this game. I don't know if it's better or worse than the original Resident Evil 2. It's a very good game, but it is missing things from the original that I wish would have been implemented in this game, like intertwined scenarios. I do feel like the developers kind of got lazy with this game with the different scenarios, and they just added A and B scenarios when originally they just weren't going to do that, but fans kind of outraged against the developers for that. So with that being said, the scenarios in this game aren't intertwined, so that means decisions that are made in playthrough A do not affect playthrough B like they did in the original Resident Evil 2, and that is kind of a bummer for me. But The game is amazing. It handles really good. It looks amazing. And like I said, I love Resident Evil 2, and this just takes Resident Evil 2 and kind of amplifies it in a modern way. The over-the-shoulder camera with the dark corridors and the sound design is just terrifying. This is almost a perfect remake in my opinion. It's very, very good. It's just missing a few things. With all that being said, I do think it is one of the better Resident Evil games, and I am going to put this in S rank, and we're going to put it slightly above the Resident Evil 1 remake, in between Resident Evil 2, I suppose, because like I said, it is missing things from Resident Evil 2.
Resident Evil.
Resident Evil 3 Nemesis is another amazing game that holds a special place in my heart. This is a game that also introduced a very iconic character with the Nemesis, a character that kind of has inspired many other characters, not only in video games, but in pop culture as a whole. This game is very, very scary, but not as scary as the first two games in the series. It's also the first game that introduced action. We have a dodge mechanic in this game, and it just feels a little bit faster than the other Resident Evil games before this one. It also is a little bit harder than Resident Evil 1 and 2. The difficulty is higher, in my opinion at least. So I don't know if that brings it down on the scale, but I just wanted to, state that. We do get the introduction of the Mercenaries mode as well, which has become a staple in Resident Evil, and actually one of my favorite modes to play in any video game. With all this being said, I really do love Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, but I just don't think it's as good as Resident Evil 2, and I don't think it's as good as the Resident Evil 1 remake. So with that being said, I'm going to have to put this game at A rank.
Resident Evil.
So we're moving on to the Resident Evil 3 remake, and this game is kind of controversial. So the success of Resident Evil 2 remake was so good that Capcom decided we're pushing out Resident Evil 3 remake as fast as we can, and thus the game felt really rushed. Now with that being said, there are some good things about this game. The Nemesis was relentless. He was much more terrifying and less annoying than Mr. X was in the Resident Evil 2 remake. So I do like the Nemesis in the Resident Evil 3 remake. But there are some things that I don't like Jill's personality. They changed her from the original Jill that I grew up with. She's more stuck up in this game. I don't know what it is about her, but I just don't like Jill Valentine in the remake. As the story progresses, she does become more likable, but she's just, in my opinion, stuck up. I just don't really like Jill in the remake, and it's kind of a shame because I do like Jill Valentine. With that being said, the gameplay is really, really good. It does flow very nicely. The dodge mechanic actually works in this game as compared to the original Resident Evil 3. But unfortunately, this game has more negatives about it than positives. Like I said, this game felt really rushed. There's a ton of content that has been cut from it, like locations, enemies, and story elements. The game is a downgrade from the original Resident Evil 3. They took out major things like a Mercenaries mode. There's no other modes in this game. You literally have the story mode, and then after you beat the story, you can unlock an Inferno mode, which is a higher difficulty mode. The game isn't as good as the Resident Evil 2 remake as well. It just is a downgrade. I don't know why they didn't take their time on this game. It had so much potential, but I was just let down by it. I loved the game when it first came out, but it might have just been because it was the new shiny thing. After playing it a few times after my first playthrough, I realized that this game actually just isn't that good. And with that being said, I have to put this game at a C rank, although I do think it's above Resident Evil 0.
Resident Evil.
So controversially, I think that Code Veronica is a main story title. I know some of you don't, but I do. and it's my opinion anyway, so we're going to talk about Code Veronica. It's a good game. It's also the first game that kind of went in the action direction when it comes to the series. They were kind of testing the waters out with action stuff in this game, like with the dual-wielding pistols and other weapons of that sort. The cinematic cutscenes were also very, very action-oriented. We get Claire running from helicopters and stuff like that. They kind of made her like an action star in this game, which was so like early 2000s, and I love it. With that being said, the game is fun. There are some drawbacks to the game, though. There is a ton of backtracking, and I mean a ton of backtracking. More backtracking than I would like to see in a Resident Evil game, honestly. So that is a major downside to this game, but other than that, I like the game, I like the gameplay, I like the characters. The story does have some plot holes, it doesn't all add up, it doesn't really make sense, so, you know, there's that, but overall, it is a good story. There just needs to be some, like, continuity fixes with the story. Now, where do I rank Code Veronica? Because I do think it's a good game, but it's not the best, and it definitely isn't the worst. I do think it's better than 0, and I actually do think that it's better than the 3 remake, so we're going to put Code Veronica at B.
Resident Evil 4.
Resident Evil 4. Man, where do I begin with this game? This is literally one of the greatest games ever created. It's a trendsetter. If it wasn't for this game, we wouldn't have most of the games that we know and love today. Literally, there are so many games that took inspiration from Resident Evil 4's playstyle. Now, with that being said, the first time I ever played this game, I simply was blown away. I remember thinking in my head, wow, what am I playing right now? I cannot believe that this exists. Is this real? This game literally changed my life, and I think it just changed gaming as a whole. Now, with that being said, Resident Evil 4 is the first game in the series that went full-on action, and it's kind of controversial because Resident Evil has always been known for horror, for being scary, and Resident Evil 4 isn't really that scary. Although it doesn't have its scary moments from time to time, it's more so about action. And in my opinion, Resident Evil is best when it's about being scary, but Resident Evil 4 kind of changes my mind on that. It's the only game in the series that is full action that I actually think is amazing, right? So it introduced so many things to the gaming genre and to Resident Evil. The over-the-shoulder, free-flowing aiming system is so good, at least for the time it was so good, and it was just like nothing we've ever seen before. I like how you can pick your shots on your target, do headshots, leg shots, and they affect the enemies accordingly to where you hit them. Also, this was the biggest map we have ever seen in Resident Evil before, so we got to explore a ton, and I mean a ton of areas. They had a looting system, they introduced the merchant. It just brought so many things to Resident Evil that we have never seen before, and I just feel so lucky to be a part of a time where this game released. You guys don't understand how big of a game Resident Evil 4 was when it released. And it still holds up to today's standards. It's still a very good game. With all that being said, you know I have to put Resident Evil 4 in the S tier. I guess I'm going to put it ahead of the Resident Evil 1 remake. So here we are with the best handling and playing Resident Evil game that we have ever gotten. Resident Evil 4 Remake. In my opinion, there is no other game in the series that plays as good as this one, or that feels as good as this game. Now, this is kind of the same thing that the Resident Evil 1 remake did with the original Resident Evil, where it takes everything from Resident Evil 4 and just makes it better, in my opinion. Yeah, that's right. I think that Resident Evil 4 remake is better than the original Resident Evil 4. Even though it didn't have the same impact on the world as Resident Evil 4 did, I do think that it is a much, much better game. It literally does everything better than the original, in my opinion. So with that being said, this is honestly one of the better Resident Evil games that we have ever gotten, and for that reason alone, I'm going to put it in S rank. I just don't know where we're going to put it. It definitely is up here. So I think we're going to put it right. I think we're going to put it at the top. I think it's going to be the best game. Yeah, we're going to put it above my favorite game, Resident Evil 2.
Resident Evil 5.
So now we're getting into a weird territory in Resident Evil with Resident Evil 5. This is the game that shifted away from horror and went full on action. While RE4 still had some of its horror elements, RE5 just went away from that entirely and just went full on action, and they even added in a co-op mode, so you can play this game with a friend, which isn't too bad. Honestly, I played this game a ton as a kid with my brother, so I actually thoroughly enjoyed this game. But as a Resident Evil game, I don't know. I mean, it doesn't feel like Resident Evil. It is a good game, though, and honestly, I do think it's one of the better co-op games that we have ever seen. So with that being said, it does take a lot of things from Resident Evil 4. I do think that it handles much better, probably because it's newer. It still has the merchant. It has an interchangeable inventory system between the two characters, kind of like Resident Evil 0 had, but it does it much, much better. So this game isn't bad. It isn't great by no means, but it's still a pretty good game, I would say. It just isn't what I would want out of a Resident Evil game. With all that being said, I am going to rank this game surprisingly in the middle. I'm actually going to put this game above Code Veronica. It's actually thoroughly enjoyable, especially if you're playing it with a friend. So we're going to put it in B tier.
Resident Evil 6.
Oh boy, here we go. Resident Evil 6. Where do I begin with this game? Resident Evil 6 is just really bad. I have to say, it's so bad. I hate this game, okay? I don't know. I don't really know what else to say about this game. Resident Evil 5 was good. It was full on action, but it was still a good and fun game to play. That's not the case with Resident Evil 6. This game has 3 different campaigns, and they're all co-op, and they all play differently, and the stories kind of intertwine, but they don't really hit like they should. The only decent story in this game is Leon's story, and it's still not that good. The gameplay itself is bad. It's really bad. You can literally, like, hand-to-hand combat the zombies. You don't even have to shoot. I don't know what the hell they were thinking with this game, but it's bad. I thought you couldn't get more action-oriented than Resident Evil 5, and then this game came out. The only saving grace for this game is the Mercenaries mode, and that's just because Mercenaries is an action-oriented mode, so that was kind of fun. Let me put it this way, guys. Resident Evil 6 is a game that I pre-ordered and got on day 1. Back in the day where we had to go to GameStop and wait for midnight releases. So I was really excited for this game. I got it home, I played all these scenarios, I beat the game, I played Ada's scenario. I played it for probably about a month. I did everything that I could in this game, and then I returned it to GameStop. It's the only Resident Evil game that I have ever done that with. And honestly, I have no urge to play this game ever again, and I don't think I ever will touch it ever again in my life. That's how much I dislike this game. So with that being said, it's no surprise. This game's going in D tier. Honestly, it's an F tier in my opinion. Resident Evil's saving grace, Resident Evil 7. Man, there's a lot of stuff I can say about this game, but I'm going to keep it short and sweet. Literally, after Resident Evil 6, the genre or the series was dying. They were shifting the full-on action, and it just was not working. And as a Resident Evil fan, I was just thinking, man, this series is dead. There's no saving it. And then came along Resident Evil 7, and I was surprised of how good it was. They went back to the horror roots, but with a twist. It's a first-person game. It's full-on horror, and it's probably the scariest Resident Evil game that we have ever gotten. It introduced some crazy characters with the Bakers, Jack Baker and Marguerite. Like, these are some really scary characters, and it took a lot of inspiration from one of my favorite movies, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I'm a huge horror movie fan, by the way, if you guys didn't know. So I do love this game. It's super scary, and it saved the franchise. With all that being said, this game is S tier. It's really good. I think we're gonna put it above Resident Evil 4. And finally, here we are with Resident Evil 8 Village. This game is the successor to Resident Evil 7, and they introduce a lot of action elements to this game. They kind of went back to the action, but they still have horror in this game. It has everything that a Resident Evil fan of all the games would like, I would suppose. It has horror, it has action, and it has different sections of the game that feel completely different. I feel like they were like testing out a bunch of different things in this game. Basically, in my opinion, this was the original Resident Evil 4 remake. This game's overall like arcing storyline is Resident Evil 4. It has so many similarities to Resident Evil 4. They brought back the merchant. He's a different merchant than Resident Evil 4's merchant. He's called the Duke, but he still is basically the merchant. He does everything that the merchant does in those games. It's good. It's not as scary as 7. It has more action in it, and the map is huge. So that is kind of a downside to me. I'm not really a fan of the giant map. And I'm not really a fan of them going more action in this game. It is a really good game, but I don't think it's as good as Resident Evil 7. With all that being said, it is a top tier game, but I don't think it's an S tier game. We're going to put it in A tier. And that is my tier list for the mainline story games of Resident Evil. I hope you guys did enjoy this video, and I would love to hear from you in the comment section on what you think about this list, and I would like to actually hear what your list would be. So definitely sound off in the comments below. I will definitely see you down there. And of course, if you guys did enjoy the video, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel if you are new, and don't forget to turn on that notification bell. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.